We're going to talk about creation very briefly, and then we're going to talk about the creation specifically of Adam and Eve, and then more deeply into the fall of Adam and Eve. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be looking in primarily Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And Jake, is there an extra Bible? Could you? Yeah.
You can use a Bible.
I do.
$5.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay.
Anybody else want one?
My talk is better prepared than my Bible. Okay. So if you could just open up, I think we all have the same Bible, which is convenient because it all has the same page numbers. We're just going to turn to page 9. Page 9 is just the very beginning of the book of Genesis. So we're here in the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form or shape, and darkness was over the abyss, and a mighty wind sweeping over the waters. And then verses 3 to the end of the chapter are God creating. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, so you can all stop right there. And now I'm going to talk about those couple of verses and try to explain what does that mean. So Catholics have a belief that when we look at that verse in the Bible, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, what we're saying is that God created something out of nothing. There was nothing except for God. In the beginning, it was just God. The Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then what God does is existence comes to be because of something He says. So for instance, we know that our speech can create things. So if I have a contract, right? Let's say that you're going to loan me your car, or let's say you're going to loan me money, okay? So you're going to loan me money, and you say, well, Father Ezra, I don't know if I trust you, so I want this contract to be written down. You make up your contract, you write it out, and at the very bottom, right, there's, sign this place. Now, the contract will not exist as such. I won't be legally bound until I write my name down, right? We can say in a certain way, my word makes that contract exist. When I say this, yes, I agree, this is what's going to happen. Now this contract is fully enacted. It's legally binding. And so similarly, when God speaks, it creates something. Something comes out of nothing. We don't say that God took material that was already there, that was already existing. God didn't, make Play-Doh, and there's this Far Side where it says God's favorite animal is the snake because it was so easy to make. So he has the Play-Doh. He's doing this. No, actually, God creates everything. Of all that exists, it came from God. There is nothing that exists that doesn't come from God. So another way to think about this is actually J.R.R. Tolkien. Now we're all familiar with The Lord of the Rings, The Lord of the Rings, and then there's The Hobbit, and this 3-part movie series. And anyway, so now Tolkien actually talked about the creation of the world. Did you know about that? It's this other book, it's called The Silmarillion. And in that book, how Tolkien describes God creating things is he says that God was like a singer. And the singer sings, and when a singer sings, then the song is existing as long as the singer is singing. So God, and that song is coming out of God's mouth. And so as long as God is singing, creation exists. So we can say in a certain way that creation still exists because God is continually enacting it into being. Now, when God began to sing that song of creation, the angels were the first ones to come out of that song. We have seats up here if you like.
Thank you. And that one ledge was in the front row.
Okay. So God sang all creation into being, and the first things to come out of God's song were angels. Angels have no body, no spirit. They are pure spirits. And then what happens is that the angels start to harmonize with God. The angels also sing that very same song that God decided to sing. And so now angels they're in tune with God. If you ever heard a good choir, this is why we speak about the choirs of angels. Now they're singing the song. Now what happens is that God is singing the primary tune, and he's creating things out of his tune. The angels are coming along, and it's a sort of a parallel. And then what happens is there's a discordant note. Somebody tries to introduce his own theme. He doesn't want God to be the only singer. He wants to make his own song. And this angel that's trying to create his own song that makes this discordant theme that doesn't want to harmonize with the rest, well, eventually he's kicked out of the choir. And that's who the devil is. The devil is a creation of God, a pure spirit, who rebelled against God, and so eventually left God's presence. And so all of the bad angels then followed the devil as well. So this is all sort of an introduction then to understanding where we fit into God's creation. So the most important thing to know is that God created everything out of nothing. The angels are also part of God's creation. They're not little gods. They don't have their own little territories. Like God created the earth, but some other God created Mars or some other universe or planet. Sometimes we'll hear people who call themselves Christians suggest such things. But according to the Catholic understanding of the Bible, no, God created everything that exists. Sometimes people wonder, well, how do we know that something didn't create God? Where did God come from? I guess Father Jerome kind of answered that in a way. But we'd say, well, God is being itself, existence. So God is the only thing that doesn't require something to create him. Okay, so out of God's song, then we have the angels and the fall of the devil. Now after that, then out of what God does is he creates the material universe. And from that material universe, we have man. Now when most people consider the universe, what they'll do is that was the angel. Usually they're invisible. Okay. Let's see if it really works. Okay, yeah, that works. All right, great. So most people consider the world, what they're doing is they're considering material things. And they're saying, well, if I can't see it, if I can't touch it, if I can't hear it, it probably doesn't exist. And what we would suggest is that there's evidence then that there are things that we can't see, hear, touch, or taste, but they exist. Some of them are angels, and then one is God who created all things. Within the world that God creates, he creates things that have different kinds of natures. And a nature is something that expresses itself. Okay? So now this is going to be very, very interesting. So if we first consider the natures of plants, plants have a particular way of being. So this is going to be my version of a tree. Okay? Is that what a tree like? That's a little bush. Okay, all right. Okay, so tree, leafy tree. And then I need to put the roots here. Okay, and we have the ground. All right, great. Now, what do we know about that tree? The tree is going to breathe through its leaves, right? It's called photosynthesis. The tree is going to eat through its roots. It takes up water and nutrients through the roots. Okay? Now, if you compare a tree to a man will be represented by black if it works. Awesome. Okay, wow. Okay, very disproportionate. Father Ezra, if you're listening. If not, there's a frown. Okay, now consider how a tree is compared to a man. Now, man, he eats through his mouth, right? This is how we get nourishment. This is how we feed and so on. But the tree, we might say, its head is in the ground, because this is how it eats. Isn't that interesting? So it's almost like a tree is upside down. Now, what this shows us is that there's something about a tree that is unconcerned about the world around it. It doesn't have sensation. The tree can't, move around and so on. This is just how a tree is. Now, if we compare an animal, this is a generic animal with an ear and that's a tail, just in case you wonder. Okay, there we go. 4 feet. Okay, now look at, what is that? I don't know. It's generic animal. Okay. All right. Now compare what's happening with the animal versus the man. Now the animal, it has a horizontal axis. Okay. There's the head. What happens with the animal? Well, usually it's looking down to the ground, just trying to find food. It's trying to see, is there any food down there by Father Ezra's feet? And so the animal, so we say the tree is vertical, but it's upside down. The animal is horizontal. When animals walk around and they're trying to feed or they're thinking about things, they're mostly thinking about their digestive tract, aren't they? They're thinking about food, they're thinking about sleep, and they're not really communicating too much. They bark because they're afraid, if we're talking about a higher animal like a dog. And how do animals communicate? Well, they sniff each other. Sometimes they'll bark, a little squeak of delight. But ordinarily speaking, animals are kind of concerned about this part of themselves. Notice also, for an animal, that you didn't think you were getting a biology class, did you? You're like, Father, what is this about? No, you'll see. Just wait. Okay, so the other thing about animals is notice that the spine is right here, right? So why? Because this makes it really safe for the animal. If I drop a rock, if a wicked person drops a rock on the animal, it's going to protect it because the spine is one of the strongest bones, okay? And so this is actually good for the animal. Where's the soft underbelly, that fleshy part that we like to call bacon? Down here. That's the part, okay? So the animal's going to protect it. Now notice how different that is with the human being. And I'll just cover that up so you can't see it. We'll just look at me for a second. Now notice the human being. When we have our faces, we are confronting other faces. You see? When animals confront each other, they're confronting either the bottom of the head, or they're sniffing each other's behind, or something like that. Or if you consider, say, the way that we are vertical. What this means is that my delicate parts, the parts that reveal who I am, it's manifested to other people. You can see something about the human being immediately. We can tell male or female easily, usually. And it's also being vulnerable to somebody else. You can come up and knife me if you wanted to. It's much easier. You see, because these are my unprotected organs. And so what this means is that we're actually having a relationship by the very fact of our existence. You know, a person's face, there are more muscles in a person's face than anywhere else in the human body, because it's used for scowling, or being surprised, snarling, it's used for all sorts of things. Our face is revealing something about us. Now, this is kind of the case for higher animals, so like you can see a monkey and there's the sad monkey, and then you can see a dog and you can see the dog's a little angry or something like that. But consider lower animals. So you have a turtle, not expressing very much on that face, or the lizard, there's not much going on there. And then if you go down to an even lower animal, like say a clam, it doesn't even have a face, it has this hard shell. Okay, so what we start to notice is that the human being is revealed, especially in the face, and even in the very shape of our bodies. So when we start to look at Genesis, let's go back to Genesis now. We're going to skip a few verses. The first number of verses are about creating light and separating the waters and so on. But we're just going to skip ahead. We're going to go to page 10 to verse 20. Verse 20 says, Then God said, Let the water teem with an abundance of living creatures, and on earth let birds fly beneath the dome of the sky. God created the great sea monsters and all kinds of crawling and living creatures with which the water teems, and all kinds of winged birds. God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fertile, multiply, and fill the waters of the seas. Let the birds multiply in the earth. Verse 23, Evening came and morning followed, the fifth day. We're going to keep going. And God said, Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, tame animals, crawling things, and every kind of wild animal. And so it happened. God made every kind of wild animal, every kind of tame animal, and every kind of thing that crawls on the ground. And God saw that it was good. We're going to stop right there at the end of verse 25. What I'm going to suggest is that it's actually showing us precisely what I said, is that there's a hierarchy of animals. See, the first animals that God creates are those water teems with living creatures, and then birds in the sky. The thing that's common between water creatures like fish and birds is that they both have very few expressions. You can get even a bird, you know. I knew a family, they had a parrot, and the parrot had depression, and they had to give it pills. That sometimes happens. But if you looked at the parrot, you wouldn't know. He looked fine. He looked like any other parrots. You know, I mean, I'm not a parrot expert, so. But you know, if you look at a dog, you can tell a dog is sad, right? The tail's tucked beneath the legs, and if you look at a cat, you know how it's sad because it looks like a cat. So this is telling us something about the hierarchy of creatures. And this is why, in God creating the material creation, the last thing he creates is human beings. Now, the translation here I don't think is great. It says, God said, "Let us make human beings in our own image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the lowest birds of the air, tame animals, and all the wild creatures," and so on. God created mankind in his image. The image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Isn't that beautiful? Telling us about that hierarchy of creation right there in the very beginning. Now, something we're going to notice then is in the next chapter of Genesis, Adam starts to look on this creation in which he exists, and he starts to think about himself and the other things that are there. And he starts to notice that he's different from these other things. The second chapter of Genesis tells a slightly different story, and in there, first Adam is created alone, in solitude. And in Adam's solitude, he starts to consider, how am I different from these things? The second chapter of Genesis actually tells us that Adam named the animals. You ever notice how we're always trying to tame animals, but how many animals are trying to tame us? This is why the movies, what are those monkey movies? The Planet of the Apes. This is why the Planet of the Apes, it's trying to turn it all upside down. What if we were the creatures that they were jailing? But the fact is, this never happens. We never find primates putting us in zoos. We never find birds trying to count the number of hairs we have or anything like this. It's always the other way around. We're trying to make the animals talk, but they're just fine not talking with each other. We're always trying to discover dolphin language, but they're never trying to discover human language. Why? Because we're the highest of material creation. And so Adam then, he sees this, and he starts to notice that he's like these animals, but he's also different. He's like them insofar as he has a body, insofar as he thinks and he feels. They have emotions, the higher ones. But there's something different too, is that he can name them. We would call this difference the difference between his soul and the souls of the animals. Animals have a soul in a certain way. They don't have a soul that's going to be rational. Animals can love in a certain way. Dogs can love you, kind of. But only human beings can have this higher kind of love. And so this is why the church says that man has body and soul. He has a freedom, a knowledge, and a love above that of other creatures. He has a capacity for good and for evil, and he has the desire for a spiritual relationship with others. And this is why Adam feels lonely with just the animals. Even Tarzan needs to find his Jane. So we find then that in the human being, our very personality is expressed through what we see, through what we do, and the very difference of our faces compared to those of animals tells us something about something we can't see, namely our visible souls. So this is why I would say that human beings are body and soul that are inseparably connected by nature. And only with reference to the entire human person are we really getting to what a person is. Now, there's another way we can consider how we know people have souls. Souls that are different than just their bodies. So, okay, here's Father Ezra. Now, don't tell him I did this, but there's going to be Father Jerome. Uh-oh. He's sad. Okay, he's taller than me, so he gets a longer body. Okay, now what's happening here? This is Father Ezra, and there's Father Jerome, and he's really sick. Okay, can we see that? Now, what happens if Oh no, Father Drum dies. Now what's the difference? What's the difference between the human body? Have you ever seen a dead body? You know, as a priest, we celebrate a lot of funerals. And it's always striking when you see the body in the casket, especially if you visited them. You know, there's a number of people. Last week, it was on a Wednesday, I visited somebody. On a Friday, he died. Saturday, I celebrated a funeral. I saw this guy, you know. And what's the difference? There's something missing. We can't say that people are merely material human beings, and all we have is what we see, because if that were the case, then there'd be no difference between a dead body and a living body. Oh, it's that electric spark. I tell you what, if somebody's dead, you can try to spark them up as much as you want, and nothing's going to happen. So we have a soul, and the soul is what gives life to the human person. And so then when we consider this soul, it's what gives us that freedom, that knowledge, that love, that desire for human relationships. That's within us. We can't see it, but it's certainly there. So all of us then were created with that soul and with free choice. The Bible says, elsewhere it says that God created human beings in the beginning, and He left us in the power of our own inclination. He says, if you will, you can keep the commandments and act faithfully according to your choice. So before us is life and death. Whichever we choose will be given to us. God has not commanded any of us to be ungodly, and He hasn't given us permission to sin. So when Adam was created then, and we're going to change this up a bit. When Adam was created, there were animals. Adam's naming the animals. Now it's Adam, not Father Ezra. And he's created in this state of holiness and justice. He loved creation. He was in union with creation. There were no ecological problems. Adam was green. And then Adam was lonely, and so God created Eve. And God gave Eve, the woman, to Adam. Now, you know, the story in Genesis says that Adam went into a deep sleep, and that God took a rib from Adam, and that He created a woman out of that. Now, the reason why, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, is because he says if Eve was taken from the foot, it would mean that she was lower. And if she was taken from the head, it could mean that she was higher. But she was taken from the bone that's closest to the heart, and it shows that they're equal. So they both then have equal freedom, equal dignity, equal knowledge, equal love. And out of that authentic freedom then they come to know each other. We all want to know others and to be known. Don't you ever, isn't one of the most lonely feelings when you feel like nobody actually knows you? Like, they just don't get it. Now, I have to admit, sometimes, that can get tricky. I got a phone call from a young man one time, and he says, Father, I talked to my girlfriend for 6 hours on the phone, and we're up till 2 a.m., and she still wants to talk. And he says, and I can't make her happy. He says, I tell her I have to go to bed because I need to wake up for work, and she says, don't you love me? And I said, don't worry, it's going to be like that the rest of your life. So we all want to be known, and we want others to know us, don't we? Aren't you happy when people feel like, I think they really get me, I think they understand me? That makes us happy. And then when people actually love you, not just understand you, that makes you even happier. This is natural to human relationships. So this is how Adam and Eve come then, is that they come and they start to know each other, they speak to each other. It's not just grunts and growls, scratches and, shakes. This is a human relationship. What's the nature of freedom? God planted all these beautiful plants in paradise, and He told them that they had freedom to eat of all the trees except for one, the knowledge of good and evil. Now, sometimes people think that freedom is simply freedom from external things. So I'm going to be free from going to jail, or I'm going to be free from being tied down. It's a freedom from compulsion. Sometimes people will imagine that freedom is a a notion that's simply restrictive. And so they say, well, I'm free. And in their freedom, they're going to go on some crazy rampage. Whenever there's a big ruckus that's caused, in a major city, you see people going and smashing windows, and they're invading houses, and they're looting, and they're taking all the TVs and things like that. We would ask, are they really free? Are they acting freely? Well, in a certain sense, nobody's stopping them. What I would suggest, however, is that authentic freedom isn't simply being free from something. It's actually being free for something. And the way I like to do this is by talking with couples who are getting ready for marriage. Okay? So when I talk to the couple getting ready for marriage, I always like to tell them, I say, now, your freedom in choosing this other person has to be from you. If the man is, if he feels compelled, if it's a shotgun wedding, like, uh-oh, she's pregnant, dad's going to kill me, better get married, we would say he's not really free, right? Or say the woman, maybe she's not free because she has all these interior insecurities and she's afraid she'll never find a man, or that she doesn't really want to get a job. She hopes that he'll provide this for her, and so she's just really trying to find anybody, any available taker. Now, if this is the case, we would say that this is a limitation of freedom, because you're choosing out of fear, you're choosing out of some sort of external compulsion. That's not really free. People say, well, I couldn't help myself. That's a limitation of your freedom. In contrast, what I like to say to the couple is, when you marry each other, it has to be something coming from you, and you know the other person, and you say to the other person, I love you, and I know who you are, and I accept you with all of your baggage, all of your wrinkles. I accept you for who you are. And if it's going to be a mutual freedom, then they're accepting you too, right? They're saying, I know who you are, and I know about you. I've learned that you brush your teeth with your mouth open, and it's slobbery and disgusting, and that's okay. Okay, so out of my freedom, now I'm going to choose you. And so freedom then is when we know what we're doing, and then when we choose it out of that knowledge, and we're choosing a good. People who choose something that is not good for them, they become compelled to choose it, such that it becomes almost impossible for them not to choose it. This is what an addiction is. Well, I couldn't stop myself. I just couldn't, I had to have that Twinkie. I said no, and then the Twinkie said yes, and I said okay, and so I got that Twinkie, and then I felt bad afterwards. This is what an addiction is when our freedom is limited. Even though we're following our impulses, it doesn't mean that we're actually following our true selves. Does that make sense? See the two different kinds of freedom we're talking about? That freedom from something, just freedom from nobody stopping me from eating all the mountain of Twinkies that I just bought. Versus, no, freedom from I know who I am, and I know what this good thing is, or this good person is, and I'm choosing from my interior. So when God created Adam and Eve, He gave them that freedom to choose each other and to choose a relationship with Him. God said, you can be my friend. I'm not going to force you to, because that's actually impossible. We can't force people to be friends. And God said, if you choose, you can be my friend. And so then what happens? Well, as we all know, sometimes we use freedom wrongly. And with Adam and Eve, what they did was they chose not to follow God's desire for them when He says, don't eat that fruit, that knowledge of good and evil. Now, just a little brief, what does that mean, the knowledge of good and evil? And why would God want them not to have it? Basically, what it is this knowledge of what it's like to sin. What it's like to do what I know is wrong. You see, when Adam was created, he didn't have this sort of interior division in himself. All he did what was right. But he kind of wanted to know what it was like to do something wrong. Kind of had that curiosity. Well, what if I sin? What's that going to be like? And then furthermore, Adam started to think, well, maybe if I sin, if I commit the sin, then it's going to be not that bad. Now what happens, according to Genesis, is that first the devil comes down in the form of a serpent, and he tempts Eve. And he says, if you eat of this tree, you'll become like gods. And Eve says, really? Let's look and just read what that dialogue is, so you don't have to listen to my bogus paraphrase. Okay, so we're now on page 12. This is